We rarely get the opportunity to talk Missouri football, so let's get down to it with Brendan Anthony. You can join him on Mazad Podcast. So they've got all their podcasts there on audio platforms across the board, and also a YouTube channel that started but isn't quite ready to roll, but still some content there. But before we get going, Brendan, we will allow you to let everyone know where they can find you to follow Mizzou coverage.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. We are the Mazodcast. It's Mizzodcast, which is not creative, but it is just wedging Mizzou and podcast into one word. And you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, all the normal places that podcasts are available. We're also part of the Armchair All-Americans Network, which is college, or it's a sports site that handles a lot of college football. And so you can get our podcast there. You can also get write-ups about Mizzou on Armchair All-Americans.
Brendan, I'm going to allow my notes to vouch for me. I actually, by memory, wrote down Mazodcast, and then I saw something online as I referenced it, and I saw Mazod Podcast, so I went with that. But yes, Mazodcast.
Yeah, well, we joke that we know the keys to good marketing and getting your name out there are hard to spell, hard to pronounce, and hard to remember, and then hard to find on the internet. So we went with a name that sort of checks all those boxes.
Okay, it will be in the future the same as location.
Yeah.
I'll be waiting for that.
Yeah, it doesn't stick in anybody's mind.
Let's talk some Missouri football. So this is life in the SEC when you've got the 34th best recruiting class in the nation, according to 247 Sports, and you're numbered 13 out of 14 in the SEC.
Yeah, that's something we've become accustomed to, and it's actually worked out fairly well for Missouri, because what happens is in the fall when we have the SEC media days, Missouri is usually disregarded because of the recruiting class ranks, and it is odd. I mean, it's a crazy thing that you can be, in the upper tier of the country as far as your recruiting class, but at the very bottom when it comes to your conference. But the thing that we've learned about recruiting at Missouri, because this hasn't really changed, the success Missouri's had in the past has always been with recruiting classes that were not ranked that highly, is that they have benefited from transfers in the past, but they've also been known to develop talent from within. And Gary Pinkel especially was known for taking 2-3-star guys and getting them into the NFL. And a lot of that has continued under Barry Odom, especially now that he's in third, fourth recruiting classes of his tenure here. He's started to develop his own sort of style and the type of player that he recruits. And he has followed Gary Pinkel's lead in that, less worried about getting a lot of big name recruits and more concerned about filling gaps in this existing team. And that's an approach that Mizzou takes, and it doesn't get them headlines oftentimes, but it will take care of holes and continues to fill gaps in the team. Some success in Missouri. They had an 8-win season, went to a bowl game this year. That's, Barry Odom's had 3 seasons. His teams have had a better record every year. So, I think at this point you could say his recruiting has been successful. There hasn't been a significant fall off, getting rid of a coach that has been, with the program for a dozen years and had a lot of name recognition. He's, on the recruiting front, held his own to some degree, although everybody's waiting for a big splash.
And I would be a little bit surprised, and maybe some viewers will be as well, that for the breakdown of states represented by this year's current class, Missouri is actually the most represented with 7. It wouldn't surprise me, Texas with 5. We've got 19 letters of intent signed. You got 3 hard commits, so probably some caution there to make sure that those guys come into the fold. Anything stand out to you about the current class?
Well, I think that when you mentioned the number of Missouri players who are actually coming to this team, that is a big change for Barry Odom, and it's something he's been working on since he's been here. There was 2 years ago, there was a class that was highly regarded in Missouri. A lot of them from the St. Louis area, a couple of Kansas City students, and there were about 10 highly regarded recruits in Missouri that were dubbed the Show Me 10, and Barry Odom put a lot of focus on, and that sort of backfired on him late in the recruiting, because only one of those guys ended up coming to Missouri. And so then the it looked like a failure after putting so much energy and publicity into getting these in-state recruits and not being able to pull that off. So with a little less hoopla and a little bit less marketing failings, he's been able to get guys in state to buy into the program. But as far as what what this class is overall like, it is very similar to the classes he's had previously, which is just that mid-30s ranking. I think we were as high as 31 at one point, right at the end of the early signing period. But as and another thing Barry Odom's done, and this has been the same this year as in last year's, which is getting guys late, because it's a lot of times the Missouri fans that are really into recruiting, they get super excited about some kid who's highly ranked, choosing Missouri, and then midway through the recruiting process, he'll decommit and demoralizes them. And here at the Mazodcast, we've kind of got an attitude is that until they're on campus and sign their letter of intent and they're on, an official Mizzou student, don't get excited about them, because the recruiting world is crazy and there's no guarantees that they'll stick around. I mean, Ohio State and Alabama have swept in at the last moment, stolen Mizzou recruits, and it's just part of the process. So don't get excited about it, because it's going to happen every year.
Well, there's probably some folks out there excited about Kelly Bryant being one of the additions too, not through the recruiting process, but what has become the recruiting process in a secondary fashion, as this transfer portal has become the new term that everyone needs to get familiar with. It just involved a handful of high-profile quarterbacks, including Bryant, early in the process. Now here in the last few weeks, boy, my goodness, teams are being ripped apart, units being ripped apart by this transfer portal, potentially. But we'll focus on one Kelly Bryant replacing Drew Lock, and a much different type of player at that position than Lock, who is a pocket passer. Let's carve up the defense and show off the arm.
Yeah, it was a huge news story for Mizzou to land Kelly Bryant. There were a lot of other programs that were surprised and angry that Kelly Bryant chose Missouri, but it was an exciting thing here. And just more holistically, I think at a 30,000-foot level, you see all this transferring going around. I think a lot of this is an offshoot of the fact that these college football players are high profile but not paid. And so when you are a guy like Kelly Bryant who could play, start at a major program, but it happened to be eclipsed by a rare talent like Trevor Lawrence, your opportunity to play in the NFL is harmed because you're going to be on the bench for your senior season. Like, it doesn't make any sense. People give them players a lot of credit, like Jalen Hurts, for sticking around at Alabama, but even ultimately he went to Oklahoma, because you go to these programs, you risk your body, and then if you're not going to have a shot at making money down the road, why wouldn't you transfer? So I think that players are waking up to that with reality and going to opportunities that they have a chance to be seen on national television. Obviously, some of the NCAA rules have made that a little bit easier, but we've always been sort of skeptical of the recruiting rankings here at the Mazodcast, and maybe part of that is because we have never been highly ranked, so we're making excuses. But I also think that the recruiting rankings are pretty. They treat it like a science, but it is not a science. I think when you get the top 10 programs or even the top 20 programs, when those rankings do matter. I mean, it's a matter of getting number of 5-star, 4-star guys who are going to be able to contribute right away. But I really think anywhere from like 25 to 45 to 55, it's just a matter of a difference of 1 or 2 4-star players added to a 3-star recruiting class. Overall, it doesn't make as much difference in the rankings as filling those holes. And then you add the transfer stuff like you're talking about too, which don't get counted in the rankings, but have a huge impact on how a team's going to look in the next year or two. It just makes the recruiting rankings even more meaningless. And Missouri fans are very excited about Kelly Bryant, because up until he decided to come here, no one even wanted to talk about a post-Drew Lock era at Mizzou. He has meant so much to this program over the last 4 years, and we did not have an answer. And that was big. Barry Odom's biggest question mark in his recruiting was getting a quarterback, getting his own guy. This answered that question. It got people excited for somebody who's been around and knows the big stage. And then on top of that, one thing we haven't talked about is that he also landed another transfer in Sean Robinson from TCU, who won't be available next season, but will be for the following 2 years. So Missouri has really got their quarterback question answered for the next 3 seasons thanks to this transfer portal. And they've just not been able to develop a recruiting quarterback, but it won't matter for the next few years. And that's a pretty exciting thing for Mizzou, or really any college program, to have your quarterback question settled early.
So Sean Robinson's a kid that was highly, highly regarded coming out of high school. He hasn't necessarily fulfilled potential, but he has a whole lot of playing time left on his ledger. He did win the TCU starting quarterback job here in 2018 and then was injured. So definitely a good prospect there. And to your point, I would say, Brendan, that the programs that come to mind for me that outplay the recruiting rankings are Michigan State and Wisconsin out of the Big Ten. I think the two best examples. We got Stanford. There was a time in which Kansas State did, not so much recently. And I kind of tend to forget, and maybe a lot of people do as well, about Missouri recruiting in the 40s and 50s and turning those classes into really good football teams under Gary Pinkel, both in the Big 12 and his first few years, 2 out of 3 with division championships there in the SEC.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a recruiting point Odom's staff makes to potential recruits, is that, you can come to Missouri and not only will you play, but you'll make the best player out of what you have, and you'll be able to look at an NFL career. You go to Alabama, you might not play for 2-3 seasons. You may not play at all because there's so much talent on that team. I think the opportunity Mizzou presents is something that they really try to connect to some of their recruiting prospects. And I think that one thing Missouri has that they've never fully taken full advantage of is that, unlike a lot of these southern states, Alabama, they can recruit nationwide, but Missouri is bookended by 2 metro, big cities, big metro areas that have good football programs. And as long as they can learn to seal and lock those borders, a lot of the times from the West, they get Big Ten teams like Nebraska trying to come calling. And then obviously in the East, they get programs all over the place trying to pull those St. Louis kids out. But if they can lock those borders down, Missouri can be a more dangerous recruiter than they have been in the past, and not sort of have to worry about coaching up players that are maybe a 2-star recruit, but they, there is that potential there. I also think being in an SEC team is going to help Mizzou down the road more than it has, in that we're just on TV all the time. They've got their own network. The SEC is always a major topic, either good or bad, in national college sports media. So over time, I think Barry Odom is able to maintain some success here and stay with the program. I think, rather than seeing the big story being a transfer like Kelly Bryant, this story will be a major 5-star in-state recruit like Terry Beckner Jr. was for Gary Pinkel a few years back.
That is a case in which you turn the tables on Ohio State. You were talking about the Buckeyes coming in and stealing players, but if I recall that one, he was slated to go to Ohio State and chose Mizzou. And to your point about the SEC network, you might as well say that the conference has 2 networks. You might as well say that CBS is basically a second SEC network. That's all they show.
Right.
It's usually 2 SEC games, at least one every Saturday, and nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah, and Terry Beckner Jr., getting him from Ohio State, that meant a lot to Mizzou people, because they had just lost Ezekiel Elliott to Ohio State, and obviously, that was the right choice for Zeke. It worked out well, but he was a St. Louis kid, and a lot of Mizzou people had high hopes for getting him, and when they couldn't, getting Terry Beckner Jr. was finally a big win for us.
We've got Brendan Anthony on the line from Mazodcast, talking Missouri football with a lot going on. We highlight the player movement, of course, the recruiting period that's going to culminate here on the first Wednesday of February, and also the transfer portal that is factored in so heavily.